She stood in the icy forest, exhausted and trembling, with 3 puppies clinging to her side. The cold gripped everything around her, but the fear of losing them was stronger. In the distance, the silhouette of a person appeared. Her heart froze. It could be salvation, or the end. She took a step forward, not knowing what lay ahead. The night was merciless. A cold wind tore through the branches of trees black as coal, howling like the lament of a lost soul. A snowstorm whirled through the forest in a frenzied dance, covering everything with a thick layer of snow. It seemed as if nature itself had decided to bury all living things beneath this white shroud. Beneath a gnarled old oak, barely shielded by its withered branches, lay a dog. It was a large shepherd, but her body, once strong and confident, now trembled in a helpless battle against the cold. Her black and tan fur, coated with frost and shards of ice, rose and fell ever so faintly with each labored breath. She wasn't sleeping. Her gaze, full of pain, exhaustion, and fear, was fixed on the darkness beyond, where the world that had betrayed her lay hidden behind the wall of snow. Around her, like small shadows, huddled 3 puppies. Their tiny bodies pressed desperately against their mother, trembling even more than she was. Their faint whimpers were barely audible, lost in the wailing wind, but to her they sounded like knives cutting through her heart. These tiny lives depended on her, and yet she had almost no strength left. Just a few hours ago, her life had collapsed. She could still hear the car door slam shut, the sound echoing in her mind. She had run after the car, despite the sharp pain in her paws, calling out to her owner, but he hadn't even looked back. She had run until her legs gave out, and her heart drowned out her reason. The wind whipped at her face, forcing her to squint, but she had stood there, clenching her teeth to stop herself from howling in despair. She believed he would return, that it was all a mistake. But the snow erased the car's tracks, and her hope melted away with the last warmth of her body. Now, she sat here in the heart of the forest, alone and abandoned, with 3 little bundles she couldn't protect. Every breath was a struggle. Every movement drained her. The puppies, hungry and terrified, pressed against each other, as if trying to draw warmth from a source that no longer existed. With great effort, the mother rose to her feet, swaying as if burdened by an invisible weight. She circled the tree, searching for even the slightest shelter from the biting wind. The snow crunched beneath her injured paws, leaving dark marks that were quickly covered by frost. Her legs shook, but she kept moving. She leaned down to the puppies, licking each one as if trying to soothe them, whispering in a language only they could understand. One of the puppies let out a faint whimper, its tiny voice sounding like a plea for help. But there was no one in this forest, only trees wrapped in icy shrouds and the wind endlessly singing its mournful song. Suddenly, a sound broke through the night, a faint crack, as if a branch had snapped in the distance. The dog froze. Her ears, despite her weakness, stood erect, and her body tensed, ready to protect. Her heart pounded so fiercely, it seemed as though it might burst from her chest. But the sound faded, swallowed by the storm, leaving her alone once more. The night seemed endless. The cold seeped into every fiber of her being, piercing her to the core. She knew she couldn't hold out much longer, but she couldn't allow herself to stop. For the puppies, for them, she was willing to fight this merciless force until her last breath. They had to survive. At least they had to. Through the dense darkness, a faint glimmer of dawn appeared on the horizon, but this light brought no hope. It merely revealed the grim reality of their despair. Tiny figures against the backdrop of endless snowdrifts, defenseless in the face of the elements. Morning greeted the forest with its icy breath. The sun barely managed to pierce through the gray veil of clouds, offering no warmth. The world remained cold and indifferent. The shepherd dog slowly rose, shaking off the snow that had clung to her body overnight. Her legs wobbled, every muscle screaming in pain, but she couldn't allow herself to stop. The puppies huddled close to her side, their faint whimpers barely audible. Hunger gnawed at them like a sharp blade tearing from within. She had to move, had to find food and shelter. Every step through the deep snow was an act of sheer will. The cold seemed to bite into her paws, leaving behind searing pain. Her breath came heavy, turning into small clouds of vapor that dissolved in the freezing air. The puppies tried to follow her, but their tiny bodies struggled against the thick blanket of snow. One of them, the smallest, slipped and fell. The mother immediately turned back, grabbed him gently by the scruff, and lifted him. She continued forward, carrying him despite her exhaustion. The forest was empty and silent. Only the crunch of her paws sinking into the snow, and the faint whisper of the wind disturbed the oppressive stillness. From time to time she paused, listening to the silence as if hoping to hear a sound that would bring hope. But all she could hear was her own ragged breathing. Her eyes darted around, searching desperately for anything edible. She came upon a dead branch, its surface clinging to a single dried berry. Carefully, she plucked it with her teeth and laid it before the puppies. Two of them scrambled to the find, but the berry was not enough for all. She watched as the smallest, exhausted and weak, lay down in the snow, no longer trying to fight. Her heart clenched, but she forced herself to keep moving. Before long, her nose picked up a scent, faint and almost imperceptible. But it was the scent of food. It guided her through the snowy trees, pushing her to keep going. She followed it until she came to a dump site, scattered with the remnants of human life. Among the wreckage and scraps lay crumbs of bread and discarded wrappers. The shepherd approached, her body trembling with fatigue. She began digging through the snow, unearthing the crumbs, which she immediately gave to the puppies. They ate quickly, barely lifting their heads, while the mother continued searching. But the scent had drawn more than just her. From behind a pile of garbage, another animal appeared, a large fox, its fiery red fur a stark contrast against the white forest. Its eyes burned with hunger and fury. The fox growled, warning her to leave. The shepherd growled back, her instincts urging her to protect her pups. She stepped forward, shielding them with her body, the fur on her neck bristling. The fox lunged, and she met him head-on. Their bodies collided with a sound like cracking ice. She growled and bit, fighting with everything she had, while the fox tried to clamp its jaws on her leg. But her strength was greater than it seemed. With a final surge of energy, she shoved him away, forcing him to retreat. The fox vanished into the forest, but the shepherd knew he might return. Wounded and exhausted, she eventually found an old wooden shack, half buried in the snow. This place became their temporary refuge. The puppies, weary from their ordeal, fell asleep almost immediately, huddled together. She remained on guard, lying at the entrance, ready to defend her children even at the cost of her own life. Night once again descended upon the forest. Through the broken roof of the shack, the cold crept in, piercing to the bone, but the shepherd refused to shiver. Her eyes, filled with pain and fatigue, glimmered in the darkness. She knew that tomorrow would bring the same struggle. The fight for survival, for her and her pups, would only grow harder. But she was prepared to go on as long as her strength held. The silence of the night was broken only by her heavy breathing and the occasional whimper of the puppies. The moon, peeking through the clouds, cast its pale light over their small sanctuary, as if nature itself was trying to embrace them with its faint glow. Deep within the shepherd's heart, a tiny spark of hope flickered. It was too small to warm her, but bright enough to keep her moving forward. A faint dawn light pierced through the dense veil of clouds, painting the snow-covered forest in cold shades of gray and blue. The snowstorm had finally ceased, but the frost still gripped every branch, every inch of the earth. In the small shack that had become their temporary refuge, the shepherd dog lay at the threshold, her dark eyes scanning the surrounding forest as if searching for something beyond the horizon. The puppies, curled up against her belly, breathed softly, their weak breaths forming tiny clouds of vapor in the icy air. They were alive, but their condition worsened with each passing day. One of the little ones no longer stood, barely moving, only letting out a faint, almost inaudible whimper now and then. The shepherd's heart tightened with helplessness. She knew they had to keep moving. They wouldn't survive here. Her head spun with weakness, and hunger burned her from the inside out, but something, a deep, inexplicable instinct, pushed her to rise. Slowly she stood, shaking the snow from her fur, and gently nudged the puppies with her nose to wake them. They stirred reluctantly, letting out plaintive cries, but rose on their trembling legs. She had to find food. The forest greeted them with icy silence. The stillness was so profound that every crunch of her paws against the snow sounded like a thunderous crack. She walked slowly, her puppies trailing behind her, their tiny legs struggling to move through the deep snow. Their tracks formed small, fragile lines in the snow, leading toward an uncertain future. After hours of wandering, her nose caught the faint scent of smoke. It wasn't the scent of danger, but something human, something that might mean warmth and perhaps salvation. She froze, lifting her head warily. Her ears twitched, catching the faintest rustle. Ahead, beyond the snow-covered thickets, there was something. She pressed on, her movements slow and cautious, as if walking on thin ice. The forest seemed vast and empty, but suddenly it revealed a different scene. Between the trees, a figure appeared, a tall man in a dark, heavy coat, holding a flashlight. His face was tense, his gaze focused. He was searching for something. The shepherd froze. Her heart pounded wildly, like a bird trapped in a cage. The puppies, sensing her tension, froze by her side, one letting out a soft whimper. The man lifted his head, and their eyes met. She didn't know what to expect. Her past experiences with humans were filled with pain. She remembered that cold night when she had been abandoned, and the fear of reliving that moment paralyzed her. But the man made no sudden movements. He slowly crouched down, placing the flashlight in the snow to dim its light. "You're not alone, are you?" he said softly, his voice warm and gentle, like the first ray of sunlight after a long winter. The shepherd didn't move. Her body remained tense, her eyes darting between the man and his outstretched hand. In his palm was a piece of bread. The scent awakened the hunger she had been suppressing for days. The puppies, shivering from the cold, burrowed under her belly, feeling her tension. The man didn't move further. He simply waited. His face showed no threat, only compassion. Finally, cautiously and slowly, the shepherd took a step forward. Her eyes stayed wary, filled with so much mistrust and pain that the man seemed to feel it physically. Another step, and another. When she was close enough to reach the bread, her nose gently brushed against his hand. She took the piece, but she didn't eat it herself. She laid it down before her puppies. The man was struck by this gesture. He let out a soft breath as if afraid to startle her, and slowly rose to his feet. "Come with me," he said, gesturing with his hand. She didn't move. Her instincts screamed that this could be a trap, but the man's eyes held a warmth she hadn't seen in a long time. The puppies, sensing their mother's calm, began to stir, and one of them even dared to approach the man, letting out a soft squeak. The shepherd, summoning all her courage, took a step forward, then another. They followed him. She didn't know where he was leading them, but for the first time in days, a faint spark of hope flickered in her heart. His voice, quiet and reassuring, sounded like music she had long forgotten. His steps were steady, and the path he carved through the snow felt like salvation. Ahead, beyond the trees, a warm, soft light appeared, human light. She couldn't believe this light could be for her. But she followed. For her puppies. For the fragile hope that had begun to break through the layers of fear. In that moment, something within her shifted. Her mistrust lingered like an old scar, but deep inside, a seed of faith took root. Faith that perhaps the world wasn't as cold as she had come to know it. Warmth. It was the first thing she felt as she stepped inside the house. Not the piercing chill of the icy wind, nor the numbing cold that had clung to her for so long, but a soft, enveloping warmth that seemed to seep into the deepest parts of her weary body. The shepherd's legs trembled, leaving damp paw prints on the floor. The puppies, exhausted but alive, pressed against her side, the smallest of them letting out a faint whimper. The house smelled of wood and smoke from the fireplace. The crackling of the logs created a soothing sound, one that calmed her frayed nerves. The warm, soft light of the lamp bathed the small room in a gentle glow, filling it with a sense of peace. But peace was foreign to her, every part of her being remained on high alert. The man, the one who had saved her, knelt carefully in front of her, holding a bowl of something that smelled like food. The scent reached her nose, and hunger flared within her like a wildfire. But she didn't move. Her wary eyes, filled with pain and mistrust, were locked onto the man. He spoke to her in a gentle voice, but his words were lost in the frozen haze of her mind. All she saw was his outstretched hand, warm and patient. The shepherd took a tentative step forward, then another. Her legs wobbled, her heart raced, but hunger overpowered her fear. She lowered her head to the bowl, but even as she ate, her eyes never left the man. Each bite was swallowed hastily, as though it were her first meal in a lifetime. The man didn't touch her. He sat nearby, watching her with an expression she couldn't understand. There was no threat in his gaze, no malice, no intention to harm. His eyes held only sadness, a deep, unspoken sorrow, as if he could feel all the pain and fear she carried within her. He carefully lifted the puppies and placed them in a basket lined with a soft blanket. They immediately curled up, their tiny bodies finally ceasing to tremble. She watched as he tucked them in, and something faint yet powerful stirred in her chest, something like hope. The nights in the house were quiet. The shepherd still didn't sleep. Though her body was warm, her instincts kept her tense. She lay by the door, alert to every sound. Any rustle or movement triggered a rush of anxiety. Occasionally she would rise to check the basket, to ensure her puppies were still there, still safe. Each morning the man brought food. Each time, he spoke to her in the same gentle tone, though she couldn't understand why he did it, why he stayed, why he didn't abandon her as others had before. Weeks passed. Slowly, the shepherd began to allow herself small moments of trust. She would eat without retreating to the door. She watched him as he carefully fed the puppies, adjusted their blanket, or brought warm water. It was all new to her, unfamiliar, and she didn't know how to feel about it. One morning, she approached him closer than ever before. The man sat on the floor beside the basket. His hand moved slowly toward her head, and she tensed, her body freezing in place. Her instincts screamed at her to pull back, but something stopped her. His touch was light, cautious. His fingers grazed her ears, then trailed gently down the fur on her head. She didn't move, holding her breath, bracing for pain. But there was no pain, only this warmth, this moment she couldn't quite understand. The puppies grew stronger. Their tiny whimpers turned into playful yips. Their little paws pattered across the wooden floor, and their tails wagged with joy whenever they saw the man. They were happy. They were safe. The shepherd watched them with an emotion she couldn't name. They were everything to her. They were her reason to keep going. Yet in her eyes, there was still a shadow of the past. Her scars, unseen but deeply felt, remained. One evening, as the sun set, flooding the room with golden light, she approached the man and lay down beside him. Her head rested heavily on his leg. He didn't move, didn't speak, only gently placed his hand on her back. Her eyes closed, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to relax. Her heart still bore its scars, but in that moment, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. She felt safe. This house, with its crackling fire and soft light, had become something she never thought she would find: a home. And though her past would always be a part of her, this home became her new beginning. It was a place where her wounds could start to heal,